Great to have your company. I'm David Foster, and you're watching Roundtable. Equal opportunities for all. Great idea, but what if addressing hundreds of years with little or no opportunities for some tilts the balance the other way? Affirmative action. Does it work? Does it cause resentment? Once again, looking deeper into the Black Lives Matter issue, we examine one country where affirmative action has been in place for a generation. And we'll hear complaints that in the United States, despite laws and fine words, it isn't working.
The Black Lives Matter movement has reopened the discussion on structural racism and inequality. In some Western nations, affirmative action aims to correct the unjust historic exclusion of black people from participation in employment and higher education. From the civil rights era of the 1960s until the early 1990s, these policies were credited with increasing African American social mobility in the USA. Though in some quarters, affirmative action is causing resentment. Asian American lobby groups have launched an ongoing case against Harvard University, accusing them of racial discrimination in the application process. In South Africa, the Black Economic Empowerment Policy was introduced to rectify black economic exclusion during the apartheid era. But since the end of apartheid 26 years ago, some white South Africans feel they are experiencing reverse discrimination as more black people enter prominent career roles. In the UK, the government recently announced a review into racial inequality in light of recent Black Lives Matter protests. So how can positive action be implemented, and when does it become discrimination? Has affirmative action gone too far or not far enough to tackle structural inequality?
Well, we can welcome to the program from the United States Professor Ted Shaw, Director for the University of North Carolina Center for Civil Rights. We go to Philadelphia, also in the US, of course, and say hello to Stacy Hawkins, Professor of Law at Rutgers University, who specializes in employment and diversity. And then we travel to Johannesburg, South Africa, and we welcome Thembisa Fakude from the Jazeera Center for Studies, who will give us insights into South Africa's affirmative action efforts after apartheid. Thanks to each and every one of you for joining us here on Roundtable. Thembisa, let me come to you first of all. I noticed that you say it has worked in sport, but it hasn't worked in employment in South Africa. In what way?
Well, the biggest challenge is that the larger part of South Africans are not employable because of historical reasons, lack of education and skills. So whereas you have jobs available to be filled by mainly Africans as preferred by government, the challenge that most companies find is that it's difficult to fill those positions because many of South Africans don't have appropriate skills. So what we have had then is the African diaspora, particularly from countries like Zimbabwe, coming to South Africa and occupying those positions. And we've also had the stubbornness of transformation within the workplace due to those reasons as well. So the white people have remained the main occupiers of, for example, senior positions and the middle management positions in most companies in South Africa. So the challenge is the unemployability of most South Africans because of historical reasons of lack of education, etc.
So it's mainly down to lack of qualifications. Whose fault is that?
Well, the history of this country, as you know, apartheid deprived people of the opportunity to educate themselves and acquire appropriate skills. So the fault lies squarely on the previous regime, which ruled this country from 1948. During that time,
only when it comes to the older generation, not when it comes to young people who've grown up without apartheid.
Apartheid was abolished in 1994, which is almost 26 years ago. So my generation, for example, who still regard themselves as young, some of us were privileged and lucky enough to have had education, but the majority of my generation who participated and engaged in the struggle against apartheid, most of them prioritized the struggle over education, so they didn't acquire appropriate skills. So the responsibility still lies with the previous regime.
Does it cause resentment among the minority white and Afrikaans community?
Oh, yes, and I do understand where they come from, because most of them were not part of apartheid. Most of them were born into a system which favored them, not the fault of their own. But we have a situation now where most of them are resentful, and I'm one of those who believe that at least we must have an expiry date for the current affirmative action policies in South Africa, so that we can have all South Africans, including the white South Africans, participating in the work industry.
Ted, let me come to you, and I'll quote something from an Afrikaans movement, which is Helping Hand Solidarity. They've said affirmative action drives our people out of positions. It prevents our people, Afrikaners, white people specifically, to get into jobs. There is resentment. Isn't that going to happen whatever country you're in?
Well, we hear some of the same types of concerns and issues here in the United States. Although I have to say that we just heard that, that affirmative action hasn't worked that well in employment and other sectors other than sports, and that white South Africans, Afrikaners, still have the majority of the positions, and so there's an irony there.
What do you think about the fact that some people refer to it as positive discrimination?
There are different terminologies that have been used, that are used with respect to what really amounts to conscious attempts to open up and make available opportunities to those who have been deprived of opportunities historically and who live under a legacy. There's an organization called the Equal Rights Trust, London-based, and in full disclosure, I was on the board at one time, and it's an international equal rights organization. It defines what's called affirmative action, and this is very quick if I can just refer to it. What it says, and it talks about positive action, and it is very clear that that doesn't mean that people should be treated in all circumstances the same. Sometimes it's necessary to treat people who have been disadvantaged by discrimination differently in order to give them equal opportunity.
Well, let me just bring this up on screen. This is from Michelle Mayer-Ship, head of diversity and inclusion at the big consulting firm KPMG. And she says, she's a Black American herself, affirmative action hasn't worked in corporate America. Black professionals do not want the scales tipped in their favor because when they get a seat at the table, they will not have the voice or sense of belonging. Your thoughts on that, Ted, and then we'll go to you, Stacy, and we'll talk about the law as well then.
Well, again, it depends on how we see this debate. Change in this country, and right now, the United States and the world, for that matter, because it's echoing abroad, is in the middle of a particularly important moment when it comes to issues of race. But change with respect to equality, opportunity, remedying racism didn't come and doesn't come serendipitously. It comes only as a consequence of conscious, deliberate efforts to right the wrongs of the past and continuing wrongs and open up opportunity. And so I hear that quote. But I also suggest that when people question the qualifications of people of color, whether they are African American or some other group who only recently have been able to acquire opportunities, often the hostility toward people in that group existed well before what's known as affirmative action or positive action.
Okay, I get that. Let me ask you, Stacy, I mean, is it right to suggest that even if the law says you have to include somebody not based on their color in any way whatsoever, that black people who get in certain positions, as Michelle Mayer-Shipp might have been suggesting, will sense at least that other people feel they don't deserve it?
I think that tends to be a minority position. Most of the people of color, Black people in particular, that I've spoken with don't have that kind of concern. In fact, as Ted pointed out, it's a very widespread sentiment that white people often believe in the inferiority of Black intellect and Black competence generally. And so Black people are aware that they're facing that kind of discriminatory attitude, regardless of how they achieve their position. And so I don't think that it's a legitimate concern. It's certainly not a concern that's widespread among Black people. And I would say, in response to the issue of whether or not it's working, I think that that's exactly why we've experienced the white backlash, because it is working, right? I mean, it has been effective. And so we've seen pushback as Black people have been given opportunities as they've advanced in various sectors.
So tell me about the white backlash as you see it.
So we have experienced white backlash in the United States as well. I was thinking when you said, how do I feel about the term positive discrimination? It's better than what they call it in the United States now, which is reverse discrimination. And that is the terminology that has arisen where white plaintiffs are now filing legal actions under anti-discrimination law, saying that, again, affirmative action and other positive treatment of Black and other minorities in the workplace constitutes reverse discrimination.
Have any of these cases succeeded?
Moniker. Oh, yes, yes. Yes, they have. Especially, in higher education. That's where we've seen it most often, although more recently they've not been successful. But going back to the 1970s, the kind of seminal case against the University of California involving a man by the name of Alan Bakke, the first major reverse discrimination case taken on by the Supreme Court, he was successful.
Thembisa, let's talk about this in South Africa. Have there been any challenges to the laws over there?
Well, not really. We have individuals who try to challenge government in this regard, but there hasn't been, there hasn't been many people from the white community who have challenged the government in this regard. But what we've seen small businesses, particularly white-owned businesses, concentrating and employing mainly white so as to balance the scene within the work sector in South Africa. But we have not seen a large number of white people challenging the government. But the majority of the largest sector of employment in South Africa is the medium-sized businesses, and most of those businesses are owned by white people. So what you have there, you have a continuation of employment of white people, and as a result, most Black people are disadvantaged because those companies are not in favor of affirmative action. Government,
is there any move in South Africa to reinforce the system, if you like, to change it in any particular way?
Well, the thing is that you can't even, there are no punitive measures as well. The only thing that government can do is to deprive those who don't implement affirmative action from accessing tenders from the government and work from government. Other than that, they've got no other tools or instruments that they can use to put pressure on medium-sized businesses to implement affirmative action. And that's the challenge that most South Africans are facing at the moment.
I'll come back to you in a little while, Thembisa, to ask you whether you think or whether the sentiment in South Africa is of this has worked or this hasn't worked or we can change it for the better. But let me come back to Ted and Stacy. I'm going to throw up another quote here. This is from CIPD, UK's largest HR body. Put this statement out after George Floyd's killing. We as individuals and organisations have a responsibility to ensure that no person is treated differently because of their skin, race, religion, or gender. Stacy, you first. That means white people shouldn't be treated differently either. Everybody should be treated exactly the same. And affirmative action doesn't necessarily allow for that.
Well, we have to understand the historic context of affirmative action, particularly here in the United States. there was an acknowledgement that Black people had not been treated equally for a very long time. In fact, during this country's entire history. And so affirmative action was an acknowledgement that we needed to remedy that past discrimination. And so we needed to take positive affirmative action on behalf of Black persons who had been subject to ongoing discrimination in a number of sectors: education, employment, government contracting. And
No, I sort of
so it
get
was an
that, but I mean,
acknowledgement that we needed to do something.
This statement is that no person should be treated differently because of their skin, whether they're white, Black, Hispanic, or whatever.
So that is a statement that often we see in our increasingly what we call in the United States colorblind approach to equality. But affirmative action comes from a place of acknowledging that we had to first make amends. We had to first remedy the centuries of discrimination against Black people before we could go to a place of neutral action. That is, no one was treated differently. We had to somehow compensate for those inequalities that had existed, right, and that had been allowed to perpetuate, because we had to get to a place of equality before we could have a statement of non-discrimination.
In which case, let me ask you, Ted, whether you think the scales have gone the other way, that it's tilted so far because of centuries of discrimination, so far in favor of Blacks and affirmative action, that it is now unfair on other members of society.
I would say absolutely not. Now, to be sure, in any given instance, you might see an employer or some institution implement what we know as affirmative action in a way that is inappropriate. But as a general rule, absolutely not. In the United States, African Americans still have about $1 in wealth for every $100 that white Americans have. I go back to what I said before about the Equal Rights Trust definition of equal treatment. To realize full and effective equality, it's necessary to treat people differently according to their different circumstances, to assert their equal worth, and to enhance their capabilities to participate in society as equals. You know, the point is not to treat people exactly the same, because that perpetuates advantages that people have as a consequence of racial discrimination and disadvantages other people have. We can't get to a society that is post-racial before we get to a post-racist society.
Fascinating. Stacey, on a legal point, in the UK, I don't know whether you know this, under the Equality Act of 2010, I'm going to read off a screen here. An employer is guilty of positive discrimination if they hire or seek an individual purely based on their protected characteristic, in other words, their gender, their religion, or their race. They are guilty of that. It is illegal in the UK. What is the position in the US?
So the U.S. would, under anti-discrimination law, certainly federal anti-discrimination law, prohibit employers from hiring persons solely on the basis of race. However, that rarely, if ever, happens. Obviously, other factors like qualifications, experience, and other credentials come into play. And so it is not uncommon for race to be considered one among many factors, but certainly never the determinative factor, and almost never the sole factor. So it would be equally unlawful in the United States for race to be the singular determinant for hiring someone. But
I'm wondering if there's a suspicion that race does play a part, whether that is the sole determinative factor or not.
So race may play a part. It simply can't be the determinative part under U.S. law. And so again, the standard is really because of. If it's because of race, right? If race is the determinative reason why you have chosen someone for employment, then that would violate federal anti-discrimination law. There have to be legitimate reasons beyond race for why you hire someone or terminate someone or promote someone or pay someone a particular salary. So that's true here. But again, it's almost never the case that someone is hired solely on the basis of race. But race does.
So let us now examine where it could go from here. And Thembisa, you said there needs to be an expiry date on affirmative action, positive discrimination, call it what you will. How would that work?
The thing is that if you continue with this open-ended implementation of affirmative action, at least in our case, is that we run the risk of the mass exodus or the brain drain, particularly of white people, most of whom have had a privilege of attaining proper education and skills. While we are trying to rectify and re-educate and empower the black masses of this country, I think it will not serve the economy and the country if we continue without an expiry date.
Isn't there a danger then? Isn't there a danger then that it could return to the old ways? I mean, I don't mean apartheid as a law, but I mean where the whites continue to exercise some kind of domination over a black population unless there is something like affirmative action.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, my daughter is 25 years now. She's what's known as a born free in South Africa. So her generation had almost equal opportunity. Some will argue. So I don't think we'll go back to the same situation. I think there is a large number of black young people who are now beginning to occupy meaningful positions in government and in business. So I think it will self-rectify with time. But if you continue,
so it is working to some extent. It has just been rather slow. Ted and Stacy,
it has been rather slow, and I think it has actually deprived my generation. My generation, most of whom are unskilled, have not had the chance, even though affirmative action was actually directed at addressing the challenges that my generation faced. It has not addressed that.
It takes time. Stacy, do you recognize in any way that affirmative action, I think it was a phrase coined initially by President Kennedy back in the early 1960s. Somebody obviously said it beforehand, but he gave it currency. Is it possible to recognize whether it is a success or not?
I think that it was fairly an unqualified success if you look at measures of integration in terms of employment and education, higher education in particular, and government contracting. So during the 70s and 80s, when affirmative action was most pursued in the United States, we saw dramatic increases in enrollment and attendance of Blacks in higher education, of Blacks in the professional sector, particularly in middle management, and in government contracting. And we've actually, I would like to say, measured a noticeable decline in progress since the kind of backlash to affirmative action starting in the late 80s, early 90s. And so I think that it was a success, and we can see that success not just from the measures of advancement that we saw during the implementation, but from the decline that we've seen since this retrenchment.
Ted, it's working, or at least it was.
It's working, not perfectly. I would say that the problem in this country is that we need a more full-throated commitment to what's called affirmative action. But the country has changed a great deal in the last 50 years. It's as a consequence of, not because, with all due respect, white Americans arrived by themselves at the notion that they hadn't done right by people of color and particularly African Americans, but not only. But it was because of decades and decades and more than that of struggle and commitment. And we haven't committed enough. That's why we see the unrest we're seeing in this country right now. It's not only about police shootings, although it is about that, obviously, but it's about the failure of the country to do what it needs to do to erase the legacy of inequality that's rooted in racism and racial discrimination. The continuum of slavery through Jim Crow only began to end in about 1968, 1970. That's not enough time.
And what needs to happen now? Briefly, if you will.
I think that what needs to happen now, there's something happening right now that may be different. Many African Americans are hesitant to really believe that this is a moment that's going to lead to permanent change, but something's happening now. And recognition first. When South Africa had, although it wasn't perfect, a truth and reconciliation process, the United States really hasn't had that. And so that's part of it. You got to recognize the wrongdoing, whether it's to African Americans or Native Americans, other groups of people. And secondly, a real commitment to provide opportunity and education from the elementary school level right on up through postgraduate education, but also
I hate to stop you, but I know the list is incredibly long, and unfortunately, we're out of time on this program. I want to say, Thembisa, great to see you again. Ted and Stacy, really nice to hear your thoughts for the very first time. And thank you, wherever you happen to be, for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, we hope to have company next time. Goodbye for now.